This is episode number 172. When I started Red Podcast, I hired one guy to help me do it. His name is Dave Jackson, and he's here on this episode to help you do the same.
This is the Red Podcast. How to take your idea and make a name for yourself within your industry and beyond. Spread your message. Attract a following. Rise above the noise. Here's your host, David Hooper.
Dave Jackson, he's the headmaster of the School of Podcasting. He's also the coach, the guidance counselor, the janitor. This is the man that I go to when I need to know about podcasting, and that's why he's here. Welcome to Red Podcast, Dave.
Oh, Dave, so glad to be here, buddy.
We've known each other for a long time. You were one of the first guys that I knew who got into podcasting in 2005, am I right?
Right after early 2005, late 2004 is when I first heard about it, and I got my first one up and running, the Musician's Cooler. I just remember the first time I uploaded a podcast and saw it come back down in the software, and I went, oh, this is going to be cool.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was a whole lot more complicated than you had to actually physically connect an iPod or some kind of device to your computer, and you could listen to it on the computer, I guess, but that's not portable. It's a whole lot easier now. It's a great time for people to get involved. So let's talk about the power of podcasting. What are some of the amazing things that you've seen really in the last couple of years since podcasting has kind of had a resurgence?
The one thing is you can't get people to talk to you, but if you say I have a podcast, they will. Case in point, we just saw the president come on a podcast. Not that everybody's going to have the president on a podcast, but I mean, that guy had to do 612 episodes to be ready for the president. But I mean, I've talked to people I never thought I would have growing up in the 80s when I got to interview all these old 80s musician guys, Carmine Appice. I'm like, that's really cool. I never would have been able to talk to that guy. And I've talked to a bunch of people that have had that same similar experience where they've got to talk to people that they looked up to who never would have given them the time of day, but they were able to, get that door open because they're like, oh, well, I'm kind of part of the media. I have a podcast. And in many times they have that person's target audience sitting right in front of them. So you've got that. And then the other thing is, blogs are great, newsletters are great, but when you add that tone of voice, it just gives you a whole new way to express yourself. It's hard to be sarcastic in print. And so now with a podcast, you can be. It takes you from being kind of words on a page to actually being a person. People talk about the whole know, like, and trust aspect, and that just is ramped up a bit because people realize you are a person. It just builds that connection. And in the end, relationships kind of drive everything. And so now if you can deliver great content on a regular basis, on a consistent basis, now there are those who will say you don't need to be consistent, and that's a whole nother discussion. I would say you need to be consistent in quality. You have to bring that value. But if you can be consistent, now people will actually build their schedule around you. Like you are part of their routine. I've had people tell me, Dave, you're with me every Monday on the morning drive. And so now you have that super intimate connection. And that way, now, if you do have a product, if you do have a business, if you have some sort of affiliate program for somebody else's stuff, they trust you. And if you say, I did this, it works, it's really cool, they'll go ahead and follow your link or buy your product or whatever it is, and off you go.
Well, coming from the entertainment industry, and you have as well, that's how we originally knew each other. Mm-hmm. With music, I've always said that music is the background to somebody's life. It's not what they're doing primarily. And how you just described it, podcasting can also be the background of somebody's life. And that's when they really interact with you. That's when they really incorporate you into what they're doing. They're already driving, and they're bringing you along with them. And that's how to get those repeat listeners. Somebody's not going to take time out of their day necessarily to follow up with you on Instagram or to read your blog post. But if they can do it while they're doing something else, that's how you get an in. And then later, once the connection is established, then they'll come to your blog, then they'll come to your Instagram, come to your live events, buy your products.
Yeah, you build that connection, you build that relationship, and it's kind of funny because one of these segments I do on my show, it's called The Last 5 and 5, which is not what were your 5 favorite podcasts, but what were the last 5 you listened to, and then tell us a little bit about them. And the one day somebody did one live, and they rattled them off, and they knew the host name and the website and the whole 9 yards, and I said, just for giggles, I go, what were the last 5 blogs you read? And they said, man, I read blogs all the time, and I go, great, what were they? And they go, I don't know. I go into Feedly and I look at the headlines, and I was like, it's kind of interesting how, the differences between reading a blog and a podcast, where everybody else knew the host and knew the website. This was like, yeah, it's just a headline. I read it. It was good. And then they talk about it on their podcast. So
right.
It's that relationship.
Well, that's exactly what you said just a minute ago. You were talking about the different modality that you're able to reach people with. They can hear your voice. They can hear your inflection. They get to know you, because you, Dave, you sound different than me. And we sound different than a podcaster like John Lee Dumas. The writing, when it's just black ink on a white page, pretty much the same.
Yeah. The other thing that's fun is you can have one topic and have two people cover it completely different ways just because of your background and your experience. I did an episode about getting ready to interview guests, and it was all about the technology, about here's appointlet.com will help you schedule your guests and make sure you have your time zone straight and all this other kind of technical aspect of it. And then a friend of mine, Eric K. Johnson, who's known as the podcast talent coach, did almost the exact same topic, but his was all about preparing with questions and researching your guest and all this other thing. But it was the same topic, but you have two completely different people with two different aspects. So it's one of those times when people will see, oh, well, I was going to do a podcast, but somebody's already doing a podcast on that. And I go, yeah, but they don't have your background. They don't have your experience. So it's going to be a completely different show.
Right. Taking it back to what you said earlier, too, is a podcast gives you a great excuse to reach out to people. And I think that looking at it that way, a lot of people, they think maybe, yeah, I should start a podcast, but no one will listen to it. Or as you said, it's already been done before. Taking those things off the table, they really don't matter. What matters is that you've got an excuse to walk up to somebody and start having a conversation. Even if the person says no, you have an excuse to write them. Not just like, hey, what's up? Hey, can I pick your brain? You've got a great excuse that hopefully offers them some publicity, offers them something that they would need. But even if it doesn't, you can start the connection because of it.
Oh, absolutely. And there are plenty of times where they may not come on your podcast, but the conversation you have for them to say no is just as good as if they were on your podcast. I've had people say that. They'll be like, I'll say, okay, here's my podcast or we talk about, and they'll say, yeah, I'm kind of booked up for the second. And that starts the conversation, and that's really all we need.
Right.
And so what that does then is you start to build that relationship. And sure, they're not coming on your podcast, but you start to watch that person, and anytime they have something to promote, that's when you can go back and say, I don't know if you remember we talked that one time, and I see you have a new book out or you've got a new product or whatever, and I would love to have you on the show. And that's usually when they'll say yes.
Yeah, it's like I said about developing the conversation with your audience. You're kind of sneaking in while they're in their drive, while they're doing something else, and then you become a more important part of their life. Well, this is the same way with an influencer, let's say, that you're trying to get in touch with, somebody that you're trying to make a business connection with.
It's always amazing to me that I occasionally will reach out to people really expecting them to say, oh, there's no way. And they'll say, in some cases, many times they'll say no, but I've had a lot that are like, not now. And then I've had some people that have said yes. And it doesn't hurt to say, the person I reached out this week, I haven't heard back yet, but I read Gene Simmons' latest book. And I'm like, you have a lot of really interesting opinions. You should have a podcast. I haven't heard back, but I was like, I would love to help that guy start a podcast.
Yeah, Gene Simmons?
Yeah, I'm surprised it doesn't have one.
I've read that book. Are you talking about Me Incorporated?
Yeah, I was like, wow, that was it was interesting. The fact that he kind of admitted that he's a bit of an idiot at times and a complete egomaniac and a general douchebag. And I'm like, wow, that's kind of cool.
He's definitely that at times. Yeah, that's a great book that I would recommend, Me Inc. And another good book on the subject of Kiss is Face the Music by Paul Stanley. So
yep.
If you're a Kiss fan, even if you're not a Kiss fan, these guys have built a business that is so much more than music.
Yeah.
It's branding and it's image and basically anything that you could license your name to, they have done it. So that would be a great thing for a podcast, I would think. I'd like to talk to those guys about business anytime.
Yeah.
Should everybody have a podcast? You think Gene Simmons should be, but what about just the average guy? Maybe he's got his own business, he's got a book, he's comfortable with writing, maybe not comfortable with speaking. Does everybody need a podcast, or would they benefit from a podcast?
I think it helps that I know Pat Flynn has said that he's a better speaker because he does a podcast. I know, businesses that have said they've had their, they'll mention a product and sales will go up 20%. So that sounds good. I don't think we need any more of the, two guys, one brain podcast where I'm just going to crack a couple brews. And for the record, when I say that, those people are completely happy doing exactly what they're doing. So I guess I shouldn't say we don't need them. Just to me, it's a different kind of podcast. There is the hobby podcast that just wants to fire up the mic and have some fun. I had a friend of mine tell me that he's closer now with his brothers because they're all scattered across the country, but they've now said, hey, on Sunday night, we're going to get together on Skype and we're going to talk about Formula One racing. And he said, we never could find the time to do it, but now that we have a podcast, well, we have a reason to. We have to get together because it's time to record the podcast. So
right.
That's kind of fun. That's the whole cats in the cradle, warm and fuzzy feeling when you get families doing it, and different parents now are podcasting with their kids that are like 6. They can barely talk. And I always think, man, when that kid's 16, it's going to be hilarious to listen to this podcast. So, there are lots of reasons, and they don't all revolve around money to start a podcast. I have somebody right now that I'm consulting with, and she wants to reach out to baby boomers because now that the kids are gone, a lot of baby boomers are reinventing themselves, and a lot of them are afraid to reinvent themselves. So she's trying to give them the courage and the inspiration to get off the couch and start phase 2 of your life. So there's a lot of different ways to podcast. Does everybody need one? I think everybody should try it, if nothing else, just to say, all right, well, I did my 7 episodes, I'm done.
Well, like I mentioned, it's a great excuse to go up to people. But one of the things that I've found about having a podcast, and especially a podcast that has to come out, let's say every week or a couple times a week, is that it forces me to get organized with my thoughts. And that has come in really handy when it comes to blog posts, when it comes to books. So there's some other skill sets that you'll be developing if you do have a podcast that will help you with other parts of your business, such as books, blogs, live speaking events. And certainly the speaking, you mentioned Pat Flynn being a better speaker, that does come with the territory. But do you have any tips for somebody that would maybe be afraid of getting on the mic? They don't like the sound of their voice. Does that come automatically, or is there a specific way that you would suggest practicing to get better on the mic and more comfortable with hearing your own voice?
Kind of like anything else, it is a bit of practice, but everybody hates the sound of your own voice, and that's because of science. And I always tell people to stick their fingers in their ears, not kind of like from the side, but put your finger on your jaw and then close your ears. The bass that you hear when your ears are closed, that's the part that leaves when you listen to yourself back, because I always say it's kind of like listening to a stereo with a subwoofer and then you unplug the subwoofer.
Right.
I think it's bone conduction.
Bone conduction, exactly.
Yeah. Another great name for a band. That's gone. So you're just listening through your ears. So that's one. But you really do a lot of times have the skills to podcast. All people are like, well, I don't know anything about building websites. And I go, do you use Microsoft Word? And they're like, yeah. And I go, WordPress is a lot like, Microsoft Word. It's just in the cloud. And I go, have you ever been in the car and had the phone ring? And they're like, yeah. And I go, you turn down the radio, right? And they're like, okay. And I'm like, well, you know how to mix music, because that's really all you're doing is adjusting volume levels. So a lot of this stuff that we think you have to be a super geek or whatever, it's really super easy, and the technology just keeps making it easier and easier and easier. I mean, 10 years ago, you could make a really horrible sounding podcast, and there were a lot out there with these little stick microphones from Radio Shack. You can do a podcast now using your phone. Is it going to sound as good as somebody who spent, $400 on a microphone? No, but it's completely listenable. It's not harsh. It's not going to give you a headache or anything like that. So it's pretty hard to make a bad sounding podcast. Now, you still have to provide the content, because the quality of the audio is not going to mask the lack of value if you're just talking about scrambled eggs and your dog.
Well, with that said, though, if you've got good content, if you know how to speak, people will sometimes put up with lesser sounding audio.
Absolutely. Yeah, I had a podcast once that was geared towards teachers who taught technology. Well, that's me, 100% me. And I remember it was pretty horrible. It sounded like the guy was frying bacon underwater. And I would sit through that because the content was just phenomenal. Right. So, yeah, they will put up with that. If you are delivering value, and that's really the bottom line, I always tell people you need to either impact them or inspire them, one of the two. And an impact could be, educate or make them laugh or cry or think or something. If I get at the end of the 45 minutes or 20 minutes or 4 minutes, however long your podcast is, and I go, yeah, I got nothing, then I'm probably not going to come back.
Well, just to break this episode down, I'm recording right now into a Blue Yeti mic, which I believe is on Amazon for maybe $1.25, a little over $100. Going into Skype directly with software to record it that I think costs $20-$30. And it's more or less just a Skype conversation from this end. You are on what kind of microphone?
Because I'm doing a Skype interview, I'm using an Audio-Technica 2100. Ranges anywhere in price from $50 to $80. and it's just going directly into the computer, into Skype.
So between the two of us, less than a couple $100 worth of equipment.
Yep.
And
Oh, yeah.
the ATR 2100, that's actually the mic that I normally use in the Red Room. It's a fantastic mic. It's so inexpensive. And when I was doing radio, I would use an RE20, which is about a $400, $500 mic.
Yeah.
When I started podcasting, I said, well, I'm not sure that I want to invest a couple of these mics, an extra $1,000, when I could try to do something for $100. I'm just going to see where I can go with a couple of $50 mics. Let me see how far that I can push them. They sound fantastic. So you can get great quality for, let's say, a couple $100.
Yeah. I always tell people, for the price of an Xbox, you can start a podcast. And if it's solo, it's even less. It depends on how you want to do it and what your subject is and things like that. And people always go, I don't know, $60. I go, give up Mountain Dew for a month. You'll have enough money to start a podcast.
How badly do you want this?
Exactly.
Let's talk about workflow. So if somebody listening is interested in starting a podcast, they've heard the hype, they think they want to jump in, got the equipment, spent their couple $100, what is the workflow that you have when it comes to coming up with a podcast and recording a podcast? Because you do a lot of solo podcasts. You're not contingent on a co-host. You're not contingent on somebody to interview. How does that work for you if you want to get a podcast recorded and do it every week? How do you do that?
Probably the most used app on my phone, I have an iPhone, is Voice Memos. And I'll be listening to a podcast or I'll be reading a book or something. I'm always consuming content one way or another. And if something strikes me and I'm like, ooh, I can't wait to tell my audience, I hit Voice Memo and I'll be like, all right, I'm listening to whatever podcast, the Red Podcast episode number 42, Dave talks about such and such and such and such at this time. And so I'll go back, and that will probably inspire me. There's some reason why I want to go back and listen to that. So that way I don't let anything fall through the cracks. I use things like Evernote as well on occasion. If I'm on a website, there's this thing called the Evernote Clipper, and I will just click a button, and it basically throws it into Evernote for me. And I go through the week just kind of harvesting all this stuff. I have Google Alerts that send me information. I use Feedly, a free website that I subscribe to a bazillion different blogs. So I'll fire that up and look at the headlines, and anything that I read, I'm like, oh, wow, this is really cool. I will basically save or throw into Evernote or something like that. And then come Saturday, it's time to record the show. I basically go back through all that stuff, and if it still entices me, then it's going to go into the show. And usually that's enough to fill up 45 minutes or an hour, which is typically what my show is. And then there are other tools. I do a show on Saturday morning. It's a live call-in show called Ask the Podcast Coach, and we share a Google Doc. So along the week, we'll be throwing things into this Google Doc that we're going to talk about. We always have something to talk about in case nobody calls in. So that's another thing you can do if you're using a host. There are things like Google Doc. There's OneDrive if you're on the Microsoft Kick. There's all sorts of tools like that.
But you're basically taking data and you're organizing it in some way, and then is it just an outline that you're going off of?
Yeah, for me, some people like to script their show. I like to have more of a conversation. So what I'll do is I'll figure out, okay, what do I want to say? Like, here's my topic. What are the main, 3-4 points I'm going to make? And I'll have those as a bullet point. And then when I fire up the microphone, I just picture, Dave sitting across the table, and I can't wait to tell Dave about this great thing. And did you hear that 81% of people that listen to Serial can recognize the sponsor and say what it does? Can you do that by watching TV? And if it's still, it better excite me, because if I'm not excited about the topic, there's no way I'm going to excite my audience about it. And I just think about somebody sitting next to me. I never knew I was supposed to do this, but I had a guy from radio go, you do the best thing because you never say things like, you guys are awesome. And he says, you never talk to your audience as a group. You always talk to your audience as a single person.
Right.
And I just did that because that's the way I talk. I never thought of it as, he goes, oh yeah, it makes it much more intimate. I'm like, well, yay me. I didn't know I was supposed to do that. The other thing I did in terms of workflow, as much as I love to consume content, I turned off the TV because I don't care about Dancing with the Stars, and I don't care about America's Got Talent and all this other stuff unless I'm doing a show about that. But when I turned off TV, Bret Michaels was still on VH1, so it was a while ago. I kept the internet, but I just realized that most of the stuff I was watching on TV just did nothing for me. So
Right.
I try to read books. I'll try to listen to podcasts about, my topic or whatever it is. Right now, I'm really into word of mouth marketing. That's like my top subject that I'm just researching all the time. And that's the stuff I then share with my audience. So between, the Google alerts and the blogs and, the other podcasts that I listen to, and then just the audience actually feeds me a lot of stuff. I'll check my email. Hey, Dave, have you seen this article yet? I'm always consuming content, and then I just kind of use myself as the filter, tie that in. If there's any kind of personal story or some way that I can make that entertaining instead of just reading the news, that's always the way I try to deliver it. I try to, my buzz phrase is it's edutainment. I try to make it enlightening and inspiring and educational, but I try to do it in a fun fashion. I tend to, I didn't even plan on it. In my last episode, I did an impromptu Dice Clay imitation for no apparent reason, and it was like, okay, well, I guess we're leaving that in. So
let's talk about making it personal. I just did an episode of Red Podcast, which is at redpodcast.com/161 about the importance of stories, especially in public speaking. And this would apply to podcasting as well. And this is one of the things that I think that you have done better than just about any podcaster I've seen, because you do have the great content like we're talking about now. You're always on the lookout for great content, but you're not afraid to put yourself out there personally. Now, you've had personal podcasts. You had a podcast, I know, about your marriage. You've had podcasts about all sorts of different things over the years. So I'm curious to know, how do you balance sharing personal information with your audience? Do you ever think like, maybe I better not share this, or maybe you think you're not sharing enough?
No, I've definitely had things where I go, maybe I shouldn't share this. And, in some cases, it's just like there's a little voice in your head that says, and it always makes me, if we were talking before we started about narcissism, it was like, no, this might actually help somebody out there. If you explain how you made a big mistake and this really, hurt your marriage or whatever it did, there's probably somebody that's just as stupid as you were. And if you can stop them from tripping over that, log or whatever it is that you hit, why not do it? So it's the intention of helping other people by throwing myself under the bus. It's a weird kind of thing. And if I can help somebody, that's fine. Because usually if it's something I've done that really caused problems, I will. It's a weird way to kind of help heal the wound in a way. It's like, okay, if I can help somebody else, then I don't feel so much like an idiot. I still feel like an idiot because I did something stupid. But if I can help somebody else prosper from my idiocy, okay, I guess I can live with it's a little easier to live in my own skin then.
On the subject of narcissism, one of the things that I think that you do very well, because a lot of people have all content and there's no personality. A lot of people have all personality but no content. You're balancing that. And when we talk about the Andrew Dice Clay impersonation or stories about your marriage, this is all in service of the subject of the podcast. You're still following that outline and you're still taking it from the front to the middle to the end. It doesn't just go off in tangents.
Yeah, a classic example I always throw out is I always tell people you have to have a passion to podcast. If you get into podcasting, you're like, great, what are you going to talk about? And they go, I don't know, I haven't figured it out yet. Like they just have no idea. I'm like, because if you can't tell me why you're getting into podcasts, you're never going to make it through the how. So I was explaining about the passion you need to get through. Really, the launch of the podcast is about 27 steps. And once you get it launched, it's about 8 for every episode. So that first 27 can be a little daunting. And at the time, my stepson was 16 and he lived, breathed, and ate driver's license. That's all he talked about was, can we go practice some more? And I need my license. I'm going to take the test. And I said, wow, this is the kind of passion you need to get into podcasting, because he just was all over driving. So that was an example where I could pull a story from my life to help illustrate the point of podcasting. So anytime I can tie the two together, I always do. Just on one hand, your audience kind of wants to know you. And anytime they kind of get a little piece of, I think I understand Dave now. Because when you meet somebody at a convention or whatever, they always say, I feel like I know you. And so when you give them another little nugget, they kind of do know you, and
right.
They should. So I always try to do that as opposed to just, hey, my wife said this today, and well, moving on, let's talk microphone. So I always try to tie them in that way.
Yeah, you want people invested. That takes it back to the very beginning of this. We want to get people letting us in their lives, just like they would do a friend. And that is certainly one way to do it. And it's like when you meet somebody, if you can be vulnerable at first, it gives them permission to be vulnerable back to you. And that's how relationships are made.
Absolutely. Yeah, and if you think about it, your best friend is probably your best friend because he knows your wrinkles. And he's seen you at your best, he's seen you at your worst, but yet he still calls you your best friend. So when you can kind of lower the curtain a little bit, you talked about the podcast I did with my wife. It was called Healing Our Marriage. And in the middle of it, we just about divorced because the podcast, we would get together and talk about our marriage. And it would just break into an argument. It made for a really entertaining podcast. But we had to finally sit down and go, hey, we started this podcast to help heal our marriage. And we just had to sit back and go, this isn't healing our marriage. This is ruining our marriage. And but we put it out there. And then we finally just said, yeah, we're done. Thank you so much for listening. But we got to stop or we're going to end up divorced. So, and that was, again, having to be kind of, put yourself out there, warts and all. And I have so many people said, man, I really like that podcast. Is it ever coming back? And I'm like, nope, we're still married. So that's proof of the point.
Right. And that's something in itself, the fact that you actually got through there.
Yeah.
That can show somebody that, yeah, you can make it happen. If you're doing a podcast with your wife and you're about to be divorced, well, it's not the end of the world.
Yeah. It was, well, again, it was just, it's my nature as a teacher. I always want to help people. I always tell my wife, I go, if you want me to do something for you, just start off with a sentence, can you help me? And then just whatever it is you want me to do. And 9 times out of 10, I will say yes. That's just in my DNA. And she hasn't learned that yet. She just likes to, here, you need to do this. I'm like, no, ask me if I can help you do it. And it's so much better. So, yeah, that's kind of where that podcast went. And a lot of my stuff is anything that's not kind of podcasting related. I do a show called Building a Better Dave. It's really, really sporadic, but most of it is trying to either make you laugh or think or something like that. So there's usually a point. I try not to fire up the microphone unless I have really something to say.
Well, Building a Better Dave, it's at betterdave.com. That was actually one of the inspirations for taking Red Podcasts solo. There are not a lot of solo podcasts out there. People feel they've got to have a co-host, or people feel they have to interview. And Building a Better Dave, I don't think you've ever had a co-host, and I don't think you've ever had an interview with anybody on there. I think it's just you.
Yeah, the only time I've ever had another person is I interviewed my best friend once to reveal really stupid stories that I did when I was little. But other than that, it's always been me.
Just to keep it honest.
Yeah, just me. And the next episode is going to be called 50 and Falling Apart, because I'm 50 and I'm falling apart. So
the play-by-play. Well, let's give people the play-by-play. If somebody wants to start a podcast, you have a site. It's called School of Podcasting. You also have a weekly podcast, and this is the one that I listen to every week where I get all my podcast updates. You mentioned it earlier. You're going through all this news to find out what's important, and it's basically an aggregator for me. You're telling me what's important, so I don't have to go out there and look at it myself. Schoolofpodcasting.com. If somebody wants to go to that, you're going to get them started. Am I right? It's easy, it's painless, and it's a great supportive environment where people can make mistakes, and you're going to make them better.
Absolutely. It's one of the things that a lot of people skip is the planning your podcast. And so I have actually worksheets to go through to kind of really help you figure out who is my audience, what do I want to say, what makes me special that can bring in something that maybe somebody else couldn't. So there's a lot on the planning part. A lot of people want to jump into the microphones, and that's fine. It's fun to play with the toys. But there's a big section on planning, and then you can, how to record it in Audacity and all that stuff, and then how to choose a web host and build your website, and from there, how to promote it. And then if you want to make money with your podcast, there's a little bit on that. So I always tell people, really from absolute 0 up to 100, we can get you through the whole process. And the cool thing is, I'm there to answer all your questions. Then we also have a private Facebook group. So if you want to bounce some ideas off people. So it really is a great community. And I always say, come for the podcast, but stay for the community.
The community is great. It's a great opportunity for you to ask all the questions that you wouldn't want to ask on some of the larger public Facebook groups for maybe fear of looking like an idiot. It's a very supportive group, and this is the real deal. And you break it down to a third grade level, so even if you're intimidated by plugging in a microphone, let's say, well, Dave's going to hold your hand and make it painless, because it really is just talking just like you would talk to anybody.
It really is. I would just say, and I've had people, I say, put a picture of your best friend or your aunt or your cousin or whoever it is that you feel comfortable talking to, and just pretend you're talking to them. And it's weird. I had one office where I literally was talking to the wall, and, it's a little weird, but you kind of get used to it after a while, like anything else. Your first podcast, you will hate. That's another given. It'll take you a while to get that one out. And I always say you'll hate it when you get to your 10th episode. That's when you look back on your first one and you go, ugh. But on the other hand, the 10th time you shot a basketball, you're probably better than it was the first time. So that's just, there are some things you're going to hate your voice. You will eventually hate your first episode. because you're going to get better. It's just,
Right.
there's no way around that. You're going to get better.
And I think going into it knowing that you're talking about a living document.
Yeah.
This podcast is changing with every episode, and you are going to get better. It's like you said, you're 50 and falling apart. You're constantly changing. Some things are in better shape than they used to be, and some things not so much, and the same with your podcast. And just understanding that it's not going to be perfect every time, but hopefully there's that trajectory where it is getting better, and working with something like School of Podcasting and actually being deliberate about going into your podcast, not just phoning it in, because that's the death of a lot of podcasts I've found. People start phoning it in, and that's one of the reasons here at Red Podcast we've had to change some things up. Things get stale, and you realize that you're not doing what you initially wanted to. Well, change it up. It's that living document, like I said, and that's the great thing. It's you're as good as your last one, and there's always an opportunity to get better. So schoolofpodcasting.com is the website. And the podcast itself, also School of Podcasting. You can search for that on iTunes. Any other places to get you, Dave?
That's really the big one. I mean, my blog's at davidjackson.org, but really my main site is schoolofpodcasting.com.
Any last words of wisdom for somebody who wants to start a podcast or grow his podcast that's already in existence?
You made a great point that it is a living, breathing thing, so it doesn't have to be perfect. The great thing is, I mean, Dave, you work in radio. You know, you don't have a whole lot of choice over format sometimes. Those poor DJs get stuck in that. With a podcast, you can change it all you want. You are the program director. You're the producer. You're the engineer in some cases. So it's really up to you, however you want it to be. And I finally figured this out. I believe it's Zig Ziglar, of course, who said, you don't have to be great to start, but you do have to start to be great. And to me, I love that quote, because so many people get paralysis by analysis because they're just trying to make it perfect. And it's like, it doesn't have to be perfect, because again, in 10 episodes, you're going to look at that first episode and go, ugh. So, you know, if you shoot for perfect and you miss, you're going to end up on pretty darn good.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to start and just give it a shot.
And I get paralyzed. It's hard for me to walk into the studio. I think it's as tough for me as it is for anybody. You mentioned Better Dave. You're not doing those things every week. It's tough to get in the studio sometimes.
To me, I'm always like, okay, so what's the main point? My criteria for that show, they're either going to laugh, cry, think, or groan, one of the two. And so the next episode, I'm going to try to make people laugh a little bit. But I did an episode about going to my high school reunion that I had so many people say, wow, that put me in tears. I'm trying to inspire them to do something. You know, I want to move them in some way.
Right,
so.
Right. And I think that's great to know that sometimes the best show that you can record is not recording one at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I always love those shows when people go, well, it's Monday, so, you know, I got to put out an episode. Not sure what we're going to talk about today. That's where I just go, skip.
That's exactly what you're talking about. You are the program director. You choose how often you broadcast, the type of music you play, who you talk to, who you don't talk to, and having that kind of freedom, it can be a little bit scary, but it's also very empowering once you get the handle of it. So, Dave, thanks for being here. Schoolofpodcasting.com is the website. Search for School of Podcasting on iTunes or your favorite podcasting player to hear Dave every week to get all the details on the latest and greatest podcasting opportunities. Dave, appreciate you being here.
Oh, thanks, buddy.
You've been listening to Red Podcast, Real Entrepreneur Development. Subscribe today using iTunes, Stitcher, or via RSS at redpodcast.com.